You've been lied to about what it means to be chosen. Most people go their entire lives waiting to be noticed, waiting for someone to see them, really see them, not for what they pretend to be, but for everything they're trying to hide. And most people wait forever. But what if I told you that 2,000 years ago, 5 ordinary men were stopped in their tracks by someone who already knew their names, their fears, their secrets before they ever opened their mouths? What if the most terrifying and beautiful thing that ever happened to a human being was simply being known completely and loved anyway? This is that story, and by the end of it, you may not be entirely comfortable with what it asks of you. It was an ordinary morning by the river, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself as important. Gray light on the water, the smell of mud and reeds, voices carrying across the current. John was preaching again, as he did most days, and 2 of his disciples stood nearby listening. They had followed him for some time now, learning his words, watching his habits, trusting that he was pointing them towards something greater than himself. They did not yet know how close that something was. Then John stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on a figure moving along the riverbank, unhurried, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But John knew. He had always known this moment would come. He raised his hand and pointed. "Look," he said, "the Lamb of God." The 2 disciples looked at each other. Something shifted between them in that glance, a silent agreement, a question asked and answered without words. If this man was truly the one John had been preparing them for, then everything was about to change, and they were not wrong. They followed him at a distance at first, unsure of themselves, unsure of the etiquette of approaching someone like this. How do you introduce yourself to the Savior of the world? What do you say? Do you bow? Do you speak first? Do you wait? He answered that question for them. Without warning, he turned around. He had known they were there the whole time, of course. He knew everything about them already, their hunger, their guilt, the prayers they'd whispered at night when no one was listening. He looked at them with an expression that was somehow both a greeting and an answer, and he asked them the simplest and most devastating question anyone had ever asked them: "What are you looking for?" They froze, because the honest answer was complicated. They were looking for forgiveness. They didn't know how to ask for. They were looking for a life that meant something. They were looking for proof that they were not too broken to be used for something good. But none of that came out. What came out instead was something almost embarrassingly practical. "Teacher," one of them said, "where are you staying?" It was a strange thing to say. Even they knew it was a strange thing to say. But he didn't laugh. He didn't correct them or make them feel foolish. He simply smiled, and there was in that smile an understanding so complete it was almost unbearable, and he said, "Come and see." So they went, and they stayed with him all that day, talking, listening, sitting in the quiet between words. He spoke to them about love, without sentimentality, about sacrifice without bitterness, about a God who had not forgotten his people, but had in fact sent the most unexpected possible answer to their suffering. By the time evening came, something inside both of them had shifted permanently. They had arrived as students of John. They left as something they didn't yet have a word for. Andrew could not sleep that night. The conversation from the afternoon kept replaying in his mind, not as memory, but as fire, the kind that doesn't destroy but illuminates. He lay in the dark and thought about his brother Simon, who was loud and impulsive, and full of unspent energy and longing, who had been searching for something his whole life without quite knowing what shape it had. Andrew knew that shape now. He got up before dawn. Simon was not easy to wake, but Andrew didn't need him to be fully awake to hear the words. He stood over his brother in the gray half-light and grabbed him by the shoulder and shook him once hard. And when Simon's eyes opened, confused, annoyed, ready to argue, Andrew said it before his brother could speak. "We have found the Messiah." Simon stared at him. The annoyance drained from his face, and something raw took its place, something between hope and fear, the expression of a man who has wanted something so badly for so long that he has almost stopped admitting it to himself. He didn't ask questions. He didn't go back to sleep. He simply stood up, and the two brothers walked together through the early morning toward the place where Jesus was staying. Simon stepped through the doorway and barely had time to take in the room before Jesus was already looking at him, already speaking, already calling him by name. Not the name he'd been given, but the name he was about to become. "You are Simon, son of John," Jesus said, and then, without any explanation or hesitation, "you will be called Peter." Simon Peter stood very still. The name meant rock. He thought of himself impulsive, volatile, inconsistent, the kind of man who started things and didn't always finish them, and yet this man looked at him with the absolute calm of someone who had seen the finished version, the completed work, the rock beneath the unsteady surface. It was the most frightening and the most wonderful thing that had ever happened to him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The next day Jesus set out toward Galilee. The road was dry and long, and the morning light sat flat across the hills. On that same road walked a man named Philip, who came from the same town as Andrew and Peter, who had heard fragments of what had happened by the river, who carried in his chest the quiet, persistent ache of someone who has been waiting for something without knowing exactly what. Jesus found him on the road. Or perhaps Philip found Jesus, and in a sense it didn't matter which, because Jesus had been aware of Philip long before Philip was aware of him. He stopped in front of him. He said 2 words, "Follow me." That was all. No argument, no demonstration, no list of credentials or demands, just the invitation, clean and direct, hanging in the morning air between them. And Philip looked at this man and felt something fall into place inside him, the way a key turns in a lock, the slight resistance, and then the release. He nodded. He followed. He could not contain it. By afternoon he had found his friend Nathanael and was practically pulling him by the arm, words spilling out of him in a rush. "We have found him, the one Moses wrote about, the one the prophets described. His name is Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth." There was a pause. "Nazareth?" Nathanael said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His tone said everything. The mild contempt, the skeptical tilt of his head, the slight curl at the corner of his mouth. Nazareth was nowhere. Nazareth was the kind of place that produced laborers, not saviors. He had expected better from Philip. Philip was quiet for a moment. Then he said the only thing that made sense, "Come and see." Nathanael came. He came, it must be said, with his arms half crossed and his skepticism barely concealed, because he was a man who valued honesty and found it difficult to pretend to believe something he didn't yet believe. He had spent a great deal of his life thinking carefully about what was true. He had also spent a great deal of time sitting under a particular fig tree near his home, praying, not the formal prayers of public performance, but the ragged, honest kind, the kind where you say the things you're ashamed of and ask for things you're afraid to want. He had been alone when he prayed those prayers. He was certain of that. When Jesus saw him approaching, before Nathanael had said a word, before Philip had made any introduction, Jesus spoke. "Here is a true Israelite," he said to the others standing nearby, "in whom there is nothing false." Nathanael stopped walking. He looked at Jesus carefully, the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite understand yet. "How do you know me?" he asked. Jesus smiled. There was something in the smile that was almost playful, as if he had been waiting for exactly this question. "Before Philip called you," he said, "when you were still under the fig tree, I saw you." The words hit Nathanael like cold water. He had been alone under that tree. No one had been there. No one could have seen him. And yet this man described it with the casual certainty of someone reporting a fact they had witnessed firsthand, and in his voice there was something that made it impossible to doubt, not authority exactly, but something older than authority, something that felt like the ground under your feet when you have been standing on sand for a very long time, Nathanael's arms uncrossed. The skepticism left his face completely. replaced by something he hadn't felt in years, something that felt like the relief of finally arriving somewhere after a very long journey. "Rabbi," he said, and his voice was no longer careful or measured, but open and a little broken. "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus looked at Nathanael with warmth, but also with the expression of a man who has something important left to say. "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree," he said, "but you will see greater things than this." He paused. His eyes moved to take in all of them. Philip, Nathanael, Andrew, Peter, John, these men who had come to him by different roads, through doubt and longing and the quiet pull of something they couldn't name. He looked at them the way someone looks at a beginning, not an end. "I tell you the truth," he said. "You will see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." No one spoke. Nathanael thought of Jacob, who had dreamed of a ladder stretching up to heaven, who had woken in the wilderness, and said this place is the gate of heaven. But Jacob had been asleep. Jacob had been alone. And what Jesus was describing was not a dream. It was a promise, spoken in daylight, to men who were wide awake. In the weeks and months that followed, those words came back to them again and again. They came back when they watched Jesus touch a man with a ruined hand, and the hand became whole again. They came back when they stood at the edge of a crowd and watched the blind man press his fingers to his newly opened eyes, blinking at a world he had never seen before. They came back at the graveside when the impossible thing happened, and the man they thought was finished walked back out into the living world every time. The sky seemed somehow closer. Every time the distance between the ordinary and the sacred seemed to collapse a little more. This is the part of the story no one tells you because it doesn't photograph well, and it isn't easy to explain. The thing that stayed with all five of them, longer than the miracles, longer than the teachings, longer even than the grief that came later, was the moment by the water's edge, or on the road, or in a doorway, the specific, unrepeatable moment when he looked at them and they understood that he already knew everything about them, and that, knowing it, he had chosen them anyway. Not because they were worthy, not because they would never fail him, they would spectacularly in ways that would haunt them, but because he saw something in them that they could not yet see in themselves. The question the story leaves you with is not what you think it is. It is not whether you believe he was who he said he was. The question is this: if someone already knew every hidden thing about you, every failure, every private shame, every prayer you've whispered into the dark, and looked at you and said, "Follow me," what would you do? Because your answer to that question says more about you than you might be ready to admit.